a longtime friend and donor, in exchange for gifts. The National Transportation Safety Board is on site at LaGuardia, investigating yesterday's accident when a Delta Airlines plane skidded off a runway in the middle of a snowstorm. 6 passengers had minor injuries. The runway reopened this morning. Acclaimed documentary filmmaker Albert Maysles died at his New York home yesterday at 88 after a brief battle with cancer. He was best known for documentary classics he made in the 60s and 70s with his brother. Those include Grey Gardens and Gimme Shelter. He was active right up to his death, and his latest film on the fashion icon Iris Apfel is expected to be released next month. Funeral services for the former Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Edward Egan, will be held Tuesday afternoon at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Public visitation will begin Monday afternoon. The Cardinal died yesterday at 82. Reverend Peter Schneller of New York remembers the hard, sometimes unpopular decisions Egan took at the helm of the Archdiocese.
He was a very good administrator, which enabled him to get through some difficult situations, financial difficulties, the debts, and also the consolidation of parishes.
The Catholic leader was also remembered for his prayers after the September 11th attacks. The NCAA suspended Syracuse men's basketball coach Jim Boeheim for 9 games starting next season. Other penalties include the elimination of 12 scholarships over the next 4 years. Syracuse had discovered and reported a decade-long series of violations ranging from academic misconduct to drug policy failures. The Dow Jones Industrial Average will welcome a new member this month, Apple. The California giant will replace AT&T. The long-awaited change isn't expected to affect the Dow, which is up this year, but confirms the rise of tech companies in the index. Daylight savings time starts this weekend. That means you should move your clock forward 1 hour Sunday night. It also means we're heading towards spring. It will be cold tonight with lows near 17 degrees, but we'll see temperatures in the high 30s on Saturday and high 40s on Sunday, with partly sunny skies. Camille Van Canal, Columbia Radio News.
The Justice Department released 2 reports this week, 7 months after Darren Wilson, a white police officer, killed unarmed black teen Michael Brown. The reports didn't find evidence to press federal civil rights charges against the officer, but the department detailed a pattern of unconstitutional and discriminatory behavior by Ferguson police and courts. I talked to Antonio French, an alderman in St. Louis who actively participated in the Ferguson protests. What is the significance of the report released by the Justice Department? What does it mean that they have found Darren Wilson innocent, but the system at large guilty?
Well, I think the report on the Ferguson Police Department really confirms what a lot of people have been saying for a very long time about their experience in St. Louis County. African Americans have for years talked about being targeted by local municipalities and a system really being allowed to persist out there that really feeds off poor people, mostly African Americans. And you saw in some of the statistics in that DOJ report that it really becomes a form of taxation by citation, but it's a tax that only African Americans are forced to pay.
Ta-Nehisi Coates recently wrote an article saying that the Ferguson Police Department and the city municipality were a gang operating under legal sanctions, and he called them an armed band of collection agents. Is that true in your experience?
Absolutely. You have some municipalities that are even worse than Ferguson in that surrounding community. Ferguson generates about 14% of its revenue from fines and court fees. There are some municipalities that go as high as 40%, and these almost exclusively come from African American citizens.
So what's the reaction been like in Ferguson to the Justice Department report? Does it give people hope? Do you feel like it's going to make a difference?
In and of itself, no. Do I think that the Ferguson local government is going to take it upon themselves to change? No. I think they're going to be forced. They're going to have to be forced to do it. When the DOJ report came out a few days ago, the city of Ferguson held a press conference. We were hoping to hear some acknowledgement of guilt, some taking of responsibility, asking for the resignation, for instance, of the chief of police or the city manager. None of that happened. In fact, the mayor read a prepared statement and didn't even take any questions.
So where is change actually going to come from? Because part of the problem seems to be that the people who have been part of the problem are the ones who've been asked to solve it. I mean, how's this going to work?
What we are asking for is that the Department of Justice stay here in the area. It may be forced to put Ferguson under a consent decree that will force them to do certain changes. Many of those changes and recommendations come with a price tag. The city of Ferguson may find itself unable to pay or afford some of those changes, and so the Ferguson Police Department may need to be dissolved and the largest St. Louis County Police Department take over.
You say that because this is a systemic problem, there needs to be some kind of structural change, and Eric Holder has called for structural corrective action. I'm trying to understand what structural corrective action might actually look like.
First of all, are municipalities as small as Ferguson, or even smaller, some of them with populations of only 1,000 people, do they need to have their own police departments? Should municipalities that now have systems in place where the municipality can only stay in business, can only exist with a revenue stream coming in from tickets and fines and this predatory behavior, should those towns even be allowed to have police departments?
And lastly, was there anything in the report that was surprising to you?
What was surprising and alarming and frustrating and angering was some of those specific stories, some of the content of the emails. It really shows that this culture had just been allowed to fester and just push the system of racial bias, and it was just okay. And in light of that, and in light of the whole world reading that now, that we still have not seen resignations, that we still have not seen apologies, that we still have not seen any step towards change, just shows that we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Antonio French, thank you very much for your time. Antonio French is an alderman of St. Louis's 21st Ward.
Prosecutor announced this week that they would seek the death penalty for the man charged with killing 3 Muslims in North Carolina last month. An investigation is continuing, but the murders were perceived by Muslims worldwide as an attack on their religion.
Some Muslim New Yorkers are concerned that the violent rise of the self-declared Islamic State has led to a misunderstanding about what Islam really represents. Anjali Sastry reports.
It's 10 minutes past sunset on a snowy Tuesday evening. That means it's prayer time at the Islamic Center at New York University on Thompson Street. Female students remove their shoes and file into a large, carpeted room from the left, while males enter through the right. This is one of 5 prayers Muslim students like NYU freshman Zirwa Ziamir make time for every day. Ziamir wants people to understand that Islam is a peaceful religion, through which she connects to God and remembers her purpose in life.
We have the prayer, which is like physical movements that we do, like standing and then prostrating before God. It's a tranquil state that I'm in, a very peaceful state.
Ziamir, who wears a hijab, was shopping in her neighborhood 2 years ago when a woman verbally abused her. Ziamir felt like she was being harassed by the lady for something she is not, a terrorist.
I've been cursed at. I've been told to go back to my country. I was born in the Bronx. I don't know I'm in my country.
This type of harassment is common, according to a recent Pew report, which found that Muslims are verbally and physically attacked more than other religions in 99 countries, including the U.S. The report measured acts of religious hostility by private individuals and organizations throughout 2013. While Muslims might feel singled out, Christians also face high levels of hostility, according to the Pew report. These findings come on the heels of news that young Muslims are being recruited via social media to the self-declared Islamic State in the U.S. and on a greater scale in Europe. For Ziamir, her religion has been distorted by the Islamic State.
In Islam, you can't kill an innocent soul for no reason, right? It's a defensive. You would only fight to protect yourself if someone is, inflicting harm on you.
It's up to Muslim religious leaders to teach the true meaning of the Quran, the religious text of Islam. This will keep youth from being recruited, Ziamir said.
Muslim leaders need to step up and find the right medium to teach people what is right and what is wrong.
That's just what Imam Khalid Latif is trying to do at the Islamic Center at NYU. He teaches the peaceful meanings of the Quran at weekly classes to keep youth from being radicalized.
Those of you who weren't here last week, one of the things that we spoke about was reading the Quran as a text that encourages ethical conduct. Allah is posing a question introspectively. You want to think for yourself.
Last week, 3 Brooklyn men were arrested and charged with plotting to aid the Islamic State in terrorist activities. President Obama has publicly refused to characterize the conflict as a war with Islam. But Republicans such as Congressman Michael McCall of Texas want the president to admit that radical Islam is promoting terrorist activity.
The president's reluctance to lead, combined with a false narrative about the threat we faced, has allowed radical Islamists to surge.
McCall's statement from a speech last month troubles Columbia student Fatima Warsame because she says it's a stereotype.
We're not all terrorists.
Warsame thinks governments and religious leaders in Europe need to come together to keep youth from being radicalized.
And when I look at those Muslim communities, I think about how they're not very integrated and a huge network of people have to go against this, not just the imams at the mosques, because they can't relate to the youth, by themselves.
Warsame is a board member for Columbia's Muslim Student Association and helped plan the Muslim Protagonist Conference on the campus last weekend. At the conference, students confronted issues like the Chapel Hill shootings through writing workshops. Warsame found that the shootings saddened her community, but ultimately, the tragedy made them stronger.
There's a resilience in that I'm not fearful, I'm not paranoid just because I have been wearing hijab and I have been practicing my religion.
Warsame and Ziamir want fellow Americans to understand that radical Islam does not represent all of Islam. There needs to be a continued effort to keep youth from being radicalized. But both women remain hopeful for the future. Anjali Sastry, Columbia Radio News.
There are estimated to be 4,000 homeless young people on the streets of New York City, and about 1,600 of them identify as gay, bisexual, or transgender.
A report released last week shows that many of them are trading sex for food, cash, and a warm place to sleep. On a recent Sunday, a large group of LGBT homeless youth came by a Greenwich Village church for a hot dinner. Ariel Richen reports.
Outside St. John Lutheran Church on Christopher Street, the snow is coming down. Just half a block from the site of the 1969 Stonewall riots, 50 young people chow down and catch up. But after dinner, Domingo, Jamal, and Lotus have to find somewhere else to sleep.
Where are you headed after this?
A shelter. The 24-hour Dunkin' Donuts on Wall Street.
I'm heading, don't know.
Melissa, though, will probably end up selling sex on the street.
In 2 hours, I could make $800.
She calls it street work, but the Urban Institute, a public policy nonprofit, calls it something else.
Survival sex?
Meredith Dank published a study for the Institute on LGBT homeless youth in New York. The study found that many of them trade sex in exchange for cash, food, and shelter. Over 3 years, she and her team interviewed almost 300 young people. They found that half of them come to New York from other states, looking for acceptance and a steady income.
Once they get here, I think it's definitely a harsh reality, particularly when the weather is as bad as it has been and so cold, and with very few shelter beds and other places for them to go.
And it's hard for them to find work. Kate Barnhart runs the Sunday night dinner at the church. She says that 1 in 4 youth who come in test positive for HIV, and many can't get jobs without proper identification.
Because when you're kicked out by your parents for being queer, they don't say, oh, by the way, here's your birth certificate and your transcripts and your immunization records.
And even if they do have ID,
finding employment, if their gender expression and identity doesn't match their documents, it's really hard to fill out employment applications and school applications and things of that sort.
Dank says some youth engage in sex work to pay for costly medical procedures linked to their gender. Of those in the study, almost all are Black, Latino, or biracial. Sasha Washington is a 28-year-old transgender woman. She was born male into a very large family. In grade school, she started acting like a girl.
I would go and sneak my mother lipstick, and I would just act like I'm Miss Diana Ross, and I'm prancing, and, it was inappropriate behavior for them. My father's very Southern, strictly down south.
Her parents gave her up for adoption, and she was sent to a group home. Washington bounced from shelter to shelter. Some nights she slept outside, in the city's parks and subways, clutching pepper spray and a knife. She was 15 the first time she traded sex for a place to sleep.
There's times I wish I could go back and start all over.
3 years ago, she was starving and desperate. Washington agreed to have oral sex with a man for $40. When she was ready to leave, the man, he got violent. He chopped off part of her finger.
He told me that I have a choice. I either live and give up my anal, my backside, or he'll kill me. For me to live, I had to sacrifice, so he raped me.
That's when she became close with Kate Barnhart.
And when she went to the hospital, they called the precinct, and the detectives who responded ran a warrant search on her, made fun of her, and made her feel that she was at risk for being arrested.
Washington got scared and dropped the case. She doesn't do sex work anymore. With Kate Barnhart, she's trying to help other kids who are doing sex work stay safe, or get them off the streets altogether. And for Washington, things are starting to look up.
Where are you going to be sleeping tonight?
In my own apartment that I worked hard for 3 years in Brooklyn.
According to the study, 3 out of 4 homeless youth who work the streets want what Washington has found, a way out. Ariel Richin, Columbia Radio News.
New York City is renowned as a living movie set, but in recent years, shoots for cinema and television have been focused mainly in Brooklyn and Manhattan.
Now the Bronx is getting the center of attention. In May, filming will begin on The Get Down, a Netflix original series created by filmmaker Baz Luhrmann. Alistair Gardner reports.
This morning, down at the Ghetto Film School in the South Bronx, producers of The Get Down told a small but excited crowd about their plans for the show. Executive producer Thomas Kelly says audiences can expect a coming-of-age tale rooted in a tumultuous era in the Bronx.
The show is going to be about sort of 3 kids growing up in the Bronx in the 1970s and their journey and through the next couple decades. And it's going to be an aspirational story about kids coming from somewhat difficult circumstances.
The Get Down will tell the story of a violent era which saw the birth of hip-hop and the graffiti scene. The production promises to put the Bronx back on the cultural map, and the filmmakers today said they want residents of the Bronx to play a part in making the show.
From the moment Baz conceived of the show, that we were dedicated to very much involving the community. We would love to cast children, young people from the Bronx to play these roles. We would be very excited about that.
This pledge, however, was met with skepticism. Joe Conzo is a Bronx-based photographer. He documented the Bronx and its people during the 70s and 80s. In an interview, he expressed concern about how his borough will be portrayed.
I'm tired of seeing the same old Hollywood hype of, like Fort Apache, the Bronx, that the Bronx was just a killing zone, a drug zone of, desperate, blacks and Puerto Ricans killing each other and this, that, and the other. It was far more than that. Far more than that.
The producers, however, are trying to allay these fears. Aaron Thomas is a writer and co-executive producer on The Get Down. He said that authenticity is a major priority for the show's director, Baz Luhrmann.
He's going to the greatest lengths on this project for sure to make sure that everyone who was involved in this project is actually rooted in the material, meaning from the Bronx, not only the Bronx, but the 70s Bronx.
And Luhrmann, who spoke this morning, offered further assurance to those who are cynical. He said the show will offer both a genuine portrayal of the Bronx's troubled past and a hopeful vision of its future.
Yes, of course we're not going to have a sanitized version of the Bronx. That can't happen in the beginning. But we're going to show the transformation of those characters, and I think also the borough itself, because we get to cut to the future and to the past.
The show is scheduled to arrive on Netflix in August 2016. Alistair Gardner, Columbia Radio News.
The city and state have been cracking down on landlords who harass tenants in rent-stabilized units.
Now advocates for renters are going to Albany to push for more tenant-friendly legislation. Cassandra Basler reports there is still debate whether rent regulation is good policy in the long term.
Just whenever you release them.
At 7 a.m. Tuesday morning, tenant advocates gathered at Union Square to board a bus to Albany. The group wants state legislators to repeal something called vacancy decontrol. It phases out rent stabilization by allowing landlords to charge market rates after a tenant moves out of a unit. 10% of units that were regulated in 1997 aren't anymore. The protesters want to stop that erosion, but Christopher Mayer of Columbia Business School says they're fighting the wrong battle.
If you ask me what do I think the public policy ought to be, it really ought to be focused on the most needy residents in the community and not subsidizing, people who are on the higher end who I think legitimately feel pressed.
What Mayer means is too few rent-stabilized apartments are going to low-income New Yorkers who need them the most. He says vacancy decontrol adds units to the market rate housing and drives down rent there.
To the extent that you move some units out of stabilized housing into market housing, you can collect higher property taxes on those things. And so there is a sense that this can actually be something that allows the city to garner its resources and devote its policies really towards the most needy people.
Jennifer Flynn may be an example of what he's talking about. He's a housing advocate who describes herself as middle class. She's lived in the Prospect Lefferts Gardens neighborhood of Brooklyn for 15 years. Flynn says her rent-stabilized apartment is a great place to raise her family, and she's lucky to have it. But her rent is moving towards the $2,500 threshold, and when it reaches that mark, her landlord can begin charging the market rate and begin putting more pressure on her.
I'm probably 4 years away from having to make hard decisions about, food and rent.
For now, Flynn and her family of 4 pay about $1,500 per month for their 3-bedroom apartment. By comparison, she says market rate studios 1 block away go for more than twice as much. But she says when she looks at her budget after rent and utilities,
I don't really think that I'm living on a middle class disposable, but I know, obviously I work with people who are incredibly low income and homeless, and I have a hell of a lot more money than they do, but I really feel like I'm living, close to the bone.
Alan Lightfelt says she's right to feel that way because rent has become much more of a burden for New Yorkers. He's a data scientist at StreetEasy, a New York City real estate website. He crunched numbers comparing rental rates to median incomes, and he found that the city doesn't fit the typical pattern.
Classic rule of thumb in measuring affordability is that 30% threshold. And what we had found was that in most New York neighborhoods, they completely sort of smashed that, and it's in many cases in excess of 60%, which most housing experts would consider to be a housing crisis.
And he says this shows how important rent stabilization is when it comes to keeping units affordable. But he says it's not a long-term solution to the city's problem.
It creates, a housing crisis that needs to be addressed either by increasing the housing stock so that there's just more options and that could drive down rent prices, or boosting incomes, which is the other major component to rent affordability.
Columbia's Christopher Mayer agrees that New York City needs more housing units to ease rent inflation. He adds that the long-term problems with rent regulations outweigh the short-term benefits. But as Brooklyn's Jennifer Flynn rode the bus to Albany with other housing advocates, she says it comes down to the bottom line, making rent each month.
Around us where it's not rent stabilized, there's a lot of new condos. They're insane. I mean, they're luxury housing. I don't know how there's a human being who can afford them.
Legislators in Albany are expected to take up rent stabilization legislation in June. Cassandra Basler, Columbia Radio News.
A recent study from the Bureau of Labour Statistics found that nearly 4 out of 5 millennials haven't volunteered in the past year.
Commentator and millennial Tyler Daniels was among those who did volunteer and he says it shaped who he is today.
Not long after I learned to drive, my friend Zach and I spent a lot of time running red lights in northern New Jersey, but not in a way that would have landed us in trouble with the police. We were always in Hoboken. It's the small city right on the other side of the Hudson River. It was the summer after high school. We'd drive the city's roads, sometimes 8 hours a day, cruising to the pier, eating burritos, and, constantly scanning the police radio for our next call. We were volunteering, and during our shifts, if you called an ambulance in Hoboken, We were the guys who'd show up. I was, and still am, a certified emergency medical technician, or EMT. I've been through hours of training and testing like every other EMT. I remember one time the tones went off. Beep boop, Unit 134, respond to a call for a woman with difficulty breathing. We responded, lights and sirens on, there within minutes. I walked up to the patient. She looked pale. She was leaning in over her seat, and between breaths, she looked up to me and said, "How old are you?" It wasn't the first time I'd been asked that. So I took out my stethoscope, assessed her lung sounds, and joked back, "Well, how old do I look?" We got her to the hospital in no time. She survived. Sure, I was 18 years old, and maybe I looked young, but I knew what I was doing, and I was good at it, and I liked it. Volunteer squads are pretty common in northern Jersey. My hometown offered stipends to pay for the EMT course, and the kids I knew who'd taken the course seemed to enjoy it. So for 3 months, I found time to study for the medical exams in between cramming for high school finals and working as a theater camp counselor. When you're a teenager, you think you're invincible, but often others don't take you seriously. Working in the ambulance changed everything. I wasn't just a kid anymore. When I was in uniform, I was a medical authority on a scene of police and panicking bystanders who had just called 911. Thinking about it now, it really was a lot of responsibility to give a kid. I kept with it throughout college, and I gained some of my closest friends through doing so. I've now transitioned from EMT to journalist, and I'm so busy I barely have time to sleep, let alone volunteer. I've become just another millennial, trying to pay career dues throughout my 20s. It'll probably be like this for years to come. If the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls me up, I'll look like another one of those people who doesn't volunteer. But I often find myself still thinking like a first responder. When I walk into a building, I'll scan for an AED, the thing on the wall you use if someone's having a heart attack. And I constantly speculate how I'd respond to hypothetical emergencies, should something like the little old lady in front of me on the subway collapse in chest pain. So, while I may be just another statistic, I know I'm where I am today because of my time volunteering. I'll be back out there soon.
Tyler still gets questioned as to whether or not he's in high school. You're listening to Uptown Radio, and there's more to come, so stay with us.
We're back with Uptown Radio. I'm Adelie Ponte.
And I'm Dasha Lisitsina. Uptown Radio is online at uptownradio.org. This week we're on the air at WAI FM. Here's what's coming up in the second half of our show.
The Department of Education is pledging to create more opportunities for girls to participate in school sports.
And the city's restaurants are trying to cut back on using millions of gallons of water. 30 restaurants are trying to lower their water consumption.
AM and FM radio stations aren't paying royalties to performers. Is Congress trying to keep it that way?
All that and more to come. But first, this news.
From Uptown Radio in New York, I'm Teresa Avila. The Justice Department is preparing to bring corruption charges against Senator Robert Menendez, CNN reported today. Hava Garari has more.
This ion propulsion system is fantastically efficient, but it's also very gentle. And so the spacecraft just gradually, elegantly.
The latest jobs report showed a better than expected outlook for Friday, continuing an upward trend. Employers added 295,000 jobs last month, though many analysts say stagnant wage growth remains a problem.
This ion propulsion system is fantastically efficient, but it's also very gentle. And so the spacecraft just gradually, elegantly, gracefully crept up on Ceres and slipped into orbit.
Unemployment figures also came in better than expected at 5.5%. This is the lowest rate since May 2008. Two city officials in Ferguson, Missouri have resigned from their post on Friday in the aftermath of a report from earlier this week that highlighted a series of racist emails sent by police and court employees. The officials' names have not been released. NASA's spacecraft Dawn finally went into orbit today around a dwarf planet called Ceres. It's the first time that a spacecraft has orbited a dwarf planet.
This ion propulsion system is fantastically efficient, but it's also very gentle. And so the spacecraft just gradually, elegantly, gracefully crept up on Ceres and slipped into orbit.
Dawn is also the first spacecraft to orbit 2 different alien bodies during its mission. Iraq's most revered Shiite cleric joined the United Nations top cultural official in decrying the attack on a 3,000-year-old archaeological site in northern Iraq. The so-called Islamic State plundered the site on Thursday, which is highly regarded as one of the world's most treasured archaeological sites. I'm Teresa Avila, Columbia Radio News.
The Justice Department announced today that it will soon press corruption charges against New Jersey Senator Robert Menendez. The case centers on the financial relationship between Menendez and a Florida ophthalmologist.
That's happening less than a month after New York Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver was indicted for corruption.
Just how much does this affect American politics? Fordham Law School organized a conference today to address this question. Gregoire Moll reports.
Attendees at the conference ate sandwiches and cookies as the keynote speaker showed up.
Without further ado, I give you the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara.
Bharara's office recently won an indictment against former New York Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver.
Public corruption, when it becomes pervasive especially, undermines people's faith and confidence in democracy.
Bharara says that it's not enough to go after corrupt figures. Honest people should not be let off the hook.
It's not enough to simply make sure that you're getting rid of the bad folks. You want to make sure that you are empowering, or sometimes embarrassing, the good folks at any institution that exists to do something when they see something bad going on.
But according to New York former gubernatorial candidate Zephyr Teachout, that's not that easy. Teachout says that it's become increasingly harder to fight corruption. That's thanks to the highest American Court of Justice.
The Supreme Court has been striking down anti-corruption law after anti-corruption law while we have a crisis of corruption.
The Supreme Court says that the money people give to political candidates is simply free speech. Teachout thinks that it's undermining the democratic process.
Candidates for office end up being scared that, say, Goldman Sachs is going to spend a lot of money against them, or spend their energy trying to seek out Goldman Sachs support.
Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Lessig says that it's effectively discriminating against some American citizens.
I don't think most people sort of recognize, even get it, that they are the African Americans of, the 1950s.
Lessig fought for net neutrality and other online freedoms. That made him believe that big companies are doing to politics what hackers do to the internet.
The system has been hacked, so the fact that you have one vote in an election doesn't begin to address the fact you have no vote in the critical pre-election, the money primary or the green primary that determines who gets to be a candidate.
In 2012, almost 2/3 of political contributions came from less than 1% of the American population. Gregoire Moll, Columbia Radio News.
On Monday, the European Central Bank starts a program that will inject more than €1 trillion into its economy by the middle of next year.
The policy, known as quantitative easing, is the latest move in an effort to bring the Eurozone out of its fiscal crisis.
I spoke with economist Stephanie Schmidt-Grohe, who says it's a big change for the European Central Bank.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. Can you please tell us your full name and then your position, please, so that we have...
Sure. Hi, I'm Stephanie Schmidt-Grohe. I'm a professor of economics in the Department of...
We're having technical difficulties. We'll get back to you later about this, and we're moving on to the next piece.
Last week, the U.S. Department of Education announced that the New York City Public Schools District will take steps to create more opportunities for girls to participate in sports.
The agreement comes after a 2010 complaint alleged the school district was in violation of Title IX, the civil rights legislation that aims to create equal opportunity for girls and boys in education.
As Teresa Avila reports, a host of issues makes that difficult in the city.
According to the U.S. Department of Education, New York City needs more girls' teams like East Harlem Pride. The Pride plays basketball, but this isn't just about hoops. The city needs to create around 3,900 more opportunities for girls to play sports in order to comply with Title IX. The East Harlem Pride team is relatively unusual in the city in that they have a strong girls team. That's not always the case at other schools.
I actually had no idea that was happening in New York City.
Rachel Goldman is coach of the East Harlem Pride girls basketball team. She says that Title IX was front and center in her mind when she was growing up and had to play baseball with the boys. Her students hadn't really thought about it until she explained its history to them.
They were like, oh, really? Like they literally were like, I was like, this is why you guys are allowed to play sports. And then they kind of were like, oh, when we were younger, you played ball with the boys.
The National Women's Law Center first brought the complaint against New York City schools and 11 other school districts in 2010. According to the center's Nina Chaudhry, most of those cases have already been settled, but New York City still hadn't done enough for girls.
One thing that the federal government found was that over the years, there had been a number of requests by girls to add sports, many of which were rejected, actually half or more of which were rejected.
They were rejected by the Public Schools Athletic League, which governs and funds sports in the city. But some schools don't even apply, and there's a reason for that.
Sports are very, 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 very expensive.
Susie Ort is the principal and athletic director of Park East High School in East Harlem. She says the district's athletic league covers the coach's salary, but the other funding it allocates is a pittance.
I just ordered new baseball uniforms and I dropped $1,800. That's basically the allocation is gone.
One reason there may be so few opportunities for girls to play sports is because of the small schools movement that happened during the Bloomberg administration. Academics were placed front and center, and traditionally large public schools were broken up into smaller ones. And that means athletics sometimes fell by the wayside. Smaller schools have fewer resources. The solution at Ort School is to partner with 4 other small schools in the neighborhood to form a single sports program. Ort says she couldn't imagine not investing in sports.
They're so motivational to students that for us, it felt like a worthwhile way to spend some of our precious resources.
Rashonda Burris is captain of the East Harlem Pride girls basketball team. She says sports helped improve her grades and keep her off the street. Playing just makes her happy.
Just playing basketball makes me a better person. If I'm having a bad day and it just ruins, when I come to practice, my whole day just changed. And I just be happy to be here. It's a great feeling.
Goldman says she notices her students feel a connection to the school that they otherwise wouldn't. In feeling part of a community, their grades go up and they develop a sense of integrity and time management.
All those skills are life skills, and I think kids that play sports learn them and are better team players all around when they enter the real world, not to mention that they grow up more active and healthy, usually.
To create those 3,900 new spots for girls' sports, the city has allocated $1 million over the next 4 years and will be surveying girls to see if they're getting the chances they want to play sports. Teresa Avila, Columbia Radio News.
We're going to go back to that piece we didn't have earlier. On Monday, the European Central Bank starts a program that will inject more than €1 trillion into its economy by the middle of next year.
The policy, known as quantitative easing, is the latest move in an effort to bring the Eurozone out of its fiscal crisis.
I spoke with economist Stephanie Schmidt-Grohe, who says it's a big change for the European Central Bank.
What is new now is that they are doing something that is big relative to what they have done in the past. So on Monday, March 9th, they're going to start buying assets. In particular, they're going to buy government bonds from around the euro area to increase the money supply. So they have announced a program that they will buy 60 billion euro for a number of months, at least until September 2016. And so the idea is to increase the balance sheet of the European Central Bank by about 50%.
And do you know why they've decided to take this decision now?
Well, I think it's just very natural. They look at their economy, at the euro area. They have a very clear mandate to have an inflation rate of 2%. They have been missing it for the last few years. Right now, the most recent numbers is either deflation, or if I take out oil and look at core inflation, it's like 0.5%. So they're clearly missing their inflation target. Unemployment in the periphery is very high. Growth forecasts are low. So if you are running the central bank, you're going to try everything you can think of to help. So you're going to throw the noodle against the wall until it sticks. And we know that in the US, Increasing the money supply did not lead to runaway inflation. We are not aware that it caused any harm. Maybe it was the silver bullet that helped, and so that's why they're trying it.
So why is that going to be good for the European economy?
All right, so it's good, but I think they look across the Atlantic. They look at what the U.S. did. When the U.S. economy went into crisis in 2008, the balance sheet of the central bank of the U.S. was $800 billion. And then they did something unprecedented. They increased the money supply to over $4 trillion. So they went up by a factor of 5. That was a massive quantitative easing. And we think the U.S. economy is in a better shape than the European economy. Do we really know why? Maybe yes, maybe no. But one of the things that the U.S. did is they increased the money supply so drastically. So maybe this helped. So why not copy that?
And do you think they're being too optimistic about this quantitative easing measure?
I think these guys have to try. I mean, they have tried many other things. They have inflation running way below target. Will it help? Maybe. I don't think it will hurt. That's the main thing. I don't think, that there's a very high danger of that leading to very high inflation and to the inflation target being overshot, which is a concern that is raised against that. I don't think that's a problem. And it might work. And just because it might work, I think is something good to do.
Stephanie Schmid-Grohe, thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Stephanie Schmid-Grohe teaches at Columbia University.
Each day, New York City's restaurants use millions of gallons of water. Customers drink it, cooks use it to scour dishes and fill pots. A lot of water just goes down the drain.
Restaurants are taking part in a challenge to lower their water consumption. Polo Lam reports.
It's 3 o'clock on a Thursday on West 44th Street, and the restaurant Etc. is prepping for dinner. Anna de Chevalier is the manager. As she walks into the kitchen, she notices there's a tap running.
As you can see, the challenge of water is running.
De Chevalier turns it off. She says saving water is a constant challenge in a bustling kitchen. It's a perfect example of one thing the restaurant needs to do to reach its goal of 5% water reduction this year.
When you're in the middle of service and it's busy and you need the faucet to run faster, it's hard for the kitchen.
For de Chevalier, a big part of being more efficient means educating her staff and making sure they don't leave the taps open. But there are other things too, like fixing leaks and putting aerators on the faucets to decrease water pressure. The initiative comes from the Department of Environmental Protection as a way to curb water use while the city repairs leaks to huge pipes that supply a lot of its water.
We put this out to all restaurants, working through the New York State Restaurant Association, and these are the ones that responded.
Vlada Kniff works for the Department of Environmental Protection, and she's in charge of the initiative. The group includes small chains like 67 Burger and some higher-end places like Gramercy Tavern. Each of them volunteered to take part in the Water Conservation Challenge.
Our challenge is only a year long. We are very hands-on. We go in and we work with each participant.
Over the last year, Kniff's team has been monitoring the restaurant's baseline water use. That's anywhere from 800,000 gallons for a smaller restaurant to 9 million gallons for a larger one. If they reach their goal, they could save between $4,000 and $41,000 in their water bills. Once the challenge ends, the DEP will write guidelines that all of the city's restaurants will be able to use. Sharon Megdal supports the initiative. She's director of the Water Resources Research Center at the University of Arizona.
Reducing water use is the right thing to do wherever you may be and whatever your business may be.
Unlike Arizona, New York is not facing a drought, but the state's been dipping into its supply of groundwater. Megdal says lowering use saves restaurants money. And there's another benefit. Chris Hickey is the regional director of the New York State Restaurant Association.
It might be more costly initially to be a sustainable restaurant. Your revenue pays for itself later.
Plus, he says, patrons like it when businesses put in the effort.
Sustainability is a way of life now. People will appreciate that you are trying to be sustainable.
7 o'clock is peak business time for Etc. Customers Carolyn and Chuck Bonner have just finished their dinner.
We've been coming here since it opened 10 years ago.
It's the first time they've heard of the water challenge, and they say it makes them like the place a little bit more. In the kitchen, plates clang and hot, frothy water pumps through the dishwasher. The manager, Anna de Chevalier, is happy for the restaurant and also for the planet.
We have to start conserving water because of what's happening.
She means climate change. And in the meantime, these restaurants are doing their bit. Paula Lem, Columbia Radio News.
For generations, a milestone of success for musicians was hearing themselves on the radio, until at least video called the radio star. Of course, getting on the air doesn't necessarily mean getting paid.
In the US, AM and FM radio stations don't pay royalties to performers. And now, a new resolution introduced in Congress aims to make sure they never have to. Anna Klingberg reports.
This is My Mammy by the Peerless Quartet. This recording was played on local radio in 1922. The same year, broadcasters started paying royalties to songwriters. But the Peerless Quartet as performers got nothing. That's because radio stations thought playing recordings was just a way to promote live shows. That's still the case today. But there's a battle going on. The musicians' unions want performer royalties. But the radio stations refuse, saying the cost, which could be in the billions, would ruin local stations. Dennis Wharton from the National Association of Broadcasters, or NAB, represents 14,000 radio stations around the country.
We want to grow the music pie. We want to expose new artists. But I don't think the way you do that is to punish the number one platform for exposing new music.
The NAB is lobbying for the Local Radio Freedom Act. That's a resolution introduced last week that would prohibit Congress from passing a performer royalty bill in the future. But musicians' rights organizations like Music First are fighting it. Its president, Ted Callow, is encouraging musicians to write their congressmen to stop the resolution.
It's an attempt to claim victory on the issue and declare any legislation that would advance a performance right dead on arrival.
It's no coincidence that the radio lobby introduced this resolution now. Music First has been working on a bill to be introduced later this year that would require these payments. It would mimic the bill already in place for digital broadcasters. Since 1995, web broadcasters like Pandora, Spotify, and SiriusXM have had to pay both the songwriter and the performers. Ray Hare is the president of the American Federation of Musicians.
It's not fair for us to be compensated in the digital realm and still be denied compensation in the terrestrial broadcast world.
Last year, digital outlets paid out $800 million, and Hare claims that's only 25% of total airplay. Dennis Wharton from the NAB says the cost would be devastating.
From a perspective of radio stations, that would cause loss of jobs, hurt the economics of radio stations.
And the question is, who would really benefit from performer royalties? Well, the money would go to whoever owns the master recording of the song. Usually that's not the musicians, it's the label. The performer only gets a share. So the labels stand to make millions, but individual musicians might not. And it's not like they make a lot from the digital broadcasts. A song on Spotify can receive as little as 0.06 of a dollar per stream. So to make $1, it would have to be played 167 times. Like this song, Money Right, by the band Wise Old Moon. Wise Old Moon released their first studio album on Spotify last year, and they received quite a bit of local radio play. But vocalist and songwriter Connor Milliken doesn't believe royalties are enough to pay the bills.
I don't really see my source of income from music being from these royalties to begin with. It's just like antiquated,
Milliken says a musician's goal is to get your music out there, and he's sympathetic to the radio broadcaster's position. If higher costs means less radio play, it would mean fewer people would know about his band and come to their shows. And the shows are where they really make money.
Somebody, wrote a message on one of our social media things and said, oh, I hadn't heard of you guys before, and after hearing you guys on the radio, I'm now a new fan. So I think there's a lot of ways that it can benefit you.
So far, 120 congressmen have signed on to co-sponsor the local Radio Freedom Act. Hannah Klingberg, Columbia Radio News.
The last music store in the city to sell exclusively classical sheet music will close its doors for good today at 5 p.m.
Frank Music Company opened in 1937 on West 54th Street near Broadway, but sales have dwindled in recent years, due in part to the convenience and low cost of buying sheet music online.
Miriam Sitz paid a visit to the store on its final day.
If you called Frank Music Company this week, this is what you heard.
Because we are closing at 5 p.m. on Friday, we have gotten a tremendous number of phone calls. And while we appreciate your interest and your love and your concern, we just can't answer the phone anymore.
It hasn't stopped people from calling, nor have the calls exactly lightened the mood.
It's very sad. It's a funeral. This is a terrible, terrible loss for the music community.
James Besser is a pianist and conductor. He's been a regular at the shop since the 80s. And Lee Feldman, he stumbled across a piano book to buy while browsing the scores.
You can't come across things that you wouldn't normally.
It's irreplaceable. A store like this is irreplaceable.
Heidi Rogers has owned the place since 1978. She's sold music to world-famous musicians like violinist Pamela Frank or cellist David Finkel, and to kids, buying books for their first private lessons. But times change, and people just don't come in for sheet music like they used to.
Well, years ago, 20 was a good day. Recently, 2 people a day, maybe. I had days when nobody came in.
But this final week, they're not just calling. Everyone's coming to say goodbye.
I had about 70 or 80 people yesterday and the day before. The day before that, I had about 60, which is ridiculous.
In between ringing up customers, there are details to take care of. The logistics of closing a business she's owned for almost 40 years. This is her husband.
I have to take the website down now.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Sure.
All right.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, website.
There's no website anymore, but there's still music. Hundreds of thousands of scores. And actually, that's one thing Heidi doesn't have to worry about. What remains of her inventory at the end of the day has been purchased by an anonymous donor and will be shipped across the country to the Colburn School, a music conservatory in Los Angeles.
They are really happy because they're going to have a great, great library. Good. I'm really happy because I don't have to throw stuff out.
Yeah, excellent.
And, I don't know. Except for my losing my purpose in life.
Her purpose in life may just be a casualty of a changing economy. Scores like the ones that Heidi sold can now be bought for less from retailers like Amazon, or even straight from the publishers. Or you can download it to your iPad or computer. But, of course, as with any change, something is lost.
Certainly I place highest the aesthetic of the music.
Nicholas Handel is a freelance conductor and flutist who trained at the NYU Steinhardt School.
The tactile experience of heavy paper, the organic component of typeset music, which considers the phrasing and the tempo and the spacing of the notes.
He first visited Frank Music Company 8 years ago, soon after he came to the city.
My first experience there was walking into a sort of Ollivanders-like shop where you see all of this shelving in the back with tons of scores.
That's an experience future generations of New York City musicians won't get to have. They'll have scores on their iPads or printed for free from the internet.
I think when I'm going to really feel this is after everything's finished, after this is all packed up and it goes to California and I have nothing to do.
Here's hoping that Heidi enjoys her retirement. She says she'll be spending time with her husband at their farm in the Catskills, raising chickens and surely listening to some of that beautiful music she spent the last 36 years selling. Miriam Sitz, Columbia Radio News.
When commentator Joe Sykes moved to New York, he brought with him memories of his aunt and a big green crocodile called Lyle.
My Aunt Sarah lived in an apartment on East 86th Street, 2 blocks down from a very friendly crocodile. When I was a child, Lyle Crocodile was a character in my favourite book. It was the story of the Prim family, who moved into an old brownstone on East 88th and found him living in their bathtub. He was big and friendly and had this smile that would melt the heart of even the meanest mother. Aunt Sarah was beautiful and bold and glamorous. She wore saris and gold rings. She worked for a New York fashion magazine. She lived across the sea in a magical city where crocodiles squatted in bathtubs. When Aunt Sarah came to stay in London, she'd often bring me a copy of the latest Lyle Crocodile book. I always wondered, had she met Lyle? Had she seen him out the window of her apartment? Maybe she'd even bumped into him as she was walking her Lucas Terrier on a cold Manhattan morning. We'd go driving in my granny's little Volkswagen, and she'd pretend to be an airline pilot getting the plane ready for takeoff. "Cabin crew, seats for landing," she'd say. Then she'd start revving the engine on busy London streets before rolling through the gears, faster and faster. She'd cry, "Wheels up!" and we'd fly over the roads and avenues of northwest London until a carefully placed speed bump brought us back with a bang. When I was 11, we went to America to visit Aunt Sarah. On the last night, we finally went to my aunt's on 86th. It was huge, beautiful and decadent and decorated with immaculate taste. My aunt always had immaculate taste. But that night she hardly spoke. She slurred her words and didn't touch her food. In the taxi on the way back to the hotel, I pleaded with my mum to find out if she was okay. I knew there was something wrong. My glamorous aunt suddenly seemed fragile and alone. In fact, she was severely depressed. She suffered from eating disorders, she'd lost a few jobs, and she lived in a city that no longer cared for her. She became my difficult aunt, the aunt you only invited to Christmas because you felt you had to. She died last year after a series of strokes and heart attacks, alone in her flat in South London. I remember going through her things after she died. I found these American flag rolling papers, the kind of things only a 23-year-old would own. She was just a year younger than I am now. I imagined her sense of wonder as she woke for the first time in her New York apartment. She's the reason I'm here. She made me wonder about the world. That old aunt, with her glamour and stories and mysterious life. And now I'm glad I'm here, far away from home, in a place where crocodiles might not live in bathtubs, but where, somewhere around the Upper East Side, the spirit of my aunt, my glamorous aunt, still resides.
Joe Sykes doesn't go to the Upper East Side much, but when he does, he still keeps an eye out for good old Lyle the crocodile.
That does it for this edition of Uptown Radio. Thanks for listening.
Our executive producer was Joe Sykes, senior producer Ariana Skybell, and Hava Garari handled production.
In the studio, Tyler Daniel steered the ship, with help from Hannah Klingberg and Anjali Sastry.
Senior editor Charlotte Gibson and assistant editor Ariel Richan wrangled together our scripts.
Paula Lem and Cassandra Basler invented the internet.
Special thanks to our instructors Danielle Alarcon, John Dingus, Kerry Donahue, Rick Carr. I'm Dasha Lisitsina.
And I'm Adelie Ponte. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4 p.m. You can find us anytime online at uptownradio.org. That's all for now, folks.
I don't think I'll ever get